And I'm going to start at Romans chapter 13 and verse 1. And we read there in the scriptures that everyone should submit to the governing authorities. The Greek actually says that of higher powers. For there's no authority that is not from God. And the existing authorities have been put in place by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities is resisting what God has instituted, and those who resist will bring judgment upon themselves. It's interesting that 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 13 and 16 also repeats this same sentiment within there. I'll let you read that later. But Adonai, we pray that you'd help us understand this right now and be able to grasp it and run with what you are actually saying in your word, both here and elsewhere in your word, B'Shem Yeshua. No matter where you are around the world, even particularly here in Australia and especially here in Melbourne, these days of COVID-19 government lockdowns, we are finding so many are beginning to speak out against the lockdowns that have greatly restricted our personal freedoms, especially that of worshipping in face-to-face fellowship. Never in the history of Australia has face-to-face worship been outlawed. Up until now, we've only allowed 5 people to be in here to do the online recording. Overnight, we went from face-to-face to everyone being TV evangelists. And then now we have up to 10 gathering. We can have 20 outdoors. But still, even if you're outdoors, apparently you're not allowed to sing. You can go to a football ground where there's 35,000 people and cheer your heart out. But if you have a service, you're not allowed to sing, not allowed to do much out loud. In Victoria, we've been here housebound for about 23 hours of a day, allowed out for 1 hour to go for exercise. Many have felt they've been like under house arrest. Again, people are pushing back, claiming human rights violations from these extreme restrictions, and many have protested on social media regarding the government's heavy-handed tactics and incompetence of this pandemic. We've seen the shocking accounts of heavily armed police going after someone who's holding a sign and roughing them up with handcuffs and everything else, even in shopping, outdoor shopping areas. Many have protested that. Some of our BH community have joined in physical protests, going out onto those areas where out in open areas, still walking the 1.5 metres apart, nevertheless being arrested and hit with the $1,657 fine, of which they are now contesting those fines in the court. These actions and others have caused people to come out and quote Romans chapter 13. 1 Peter chapter 2, you must obey, you must submit, because the governments are all from God, and if you don't obey and submit the government, then you are rebelling against God. What is the context? One of the main keys interpreting the Bible is that of context. You've got to ask what was going on in their world. Rav Shaul wrote to the believers there in Rome, proclaiming the good news of Yeshua. But the proclamation of the good news of Yeshua was actually against the worship of Caesar. And this book is actually a statement against the government. You've got to understand the world behind there. There was persecution going on of Jews, of Messianic Jews, and of Christians. A few years before, Claudius Caesar had expelled the Jews from Rome around the year 4950, maybe a little bit before then, it's not quite sure, because of the constant disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, who was a false messiah who tried to rise up against Caesar. What's known as insurrection, when you try to overthrow the government. The Jews now had come back into Rome, however, and they were starting to, Messianic Jews were rejoining into the congregation, but that was causing fractions and tensions as people were claiming their position back in the congregation. Paul wrote this book to calm down these divisions. That's why he starts the book. So, look, everybody has done wrong, Jew and Gentile. Everybody obtains atonement, Jew and Gentile, by Yeshua the Messiah. We are all made holy and righteous, Jew and Gentile, by the act of grace of Messiah. Nero was the Caesar at this time. He was a psychopath who ruthlessly put down any perceived insurrectionist threat against him. And we must remember that the body of Messiah itself, this whole movement, started under the accusation of insurrection against Caesar. The charge there on the cross above Yeshua's head of King of the Jews was actually an accusation against Caesar as being king. That's why he went to the cross. So therefore, the better translation here is that of insurrection. Talk about the thieves on the cross. Modern translators look at this and say, no, the better word is insurrectionists. They were rising up and charged as rising up against Caesar. There are already charges in the Roman world against believers for stirring up insurrections against Caesar. We find this in Acts chapter 17, where they shouted out against Paul and Silas and said, these men who have turned the whole world upside down have come here also. All of them are defying the decrees of the emperor because they assert there's another king of that of Yeshua. So at this same time, there were insurrectionist calls going on in Israel, with many wanting to overthrow the Roman leadership there, just as the Maccabees did to Antiochus Epiphanes IV about 200 years beforehand. Unfortunately, these insurrectionists gained more and more weight and started to do military action, and Rome came in 70 of the Common Era and destroyed the temple. So Rav Shaul is speaking here in Romans, trying to calm down any tension that may cause Nero to feel threatened, especially that of insurrection. Understand, Romans is saying here, rulers do not need to be automatically opposed. They have been placed there by God to bring law and order, so don't fear and don't seek to rise up against them. As it says there in chapter 13, and continues on from there, for rulers are not a terror for those doing good conduct, but for bad. Would you like to be unafraid of the person in authority? Then simply do what is good, and you will win his approval. For he is God's servant there for your benefit. But if you do what is wrong, be afraid. Be very afraid. Because he does not carry the sword for no reason. He is God's servant, an avenger who inflicts punishment on the evildoer. You've got nothing to worry about from rules if you obey the rules set by the government, for sure. And within here, the Pax Romana, that of Roman peace, the law and order, is there to bring peace into the empire. So if you follow them, you'd have nothing to fear. 1 Timothy chapter 2 verse 2 also says, authorities are an instrument of peaceful order. Again, don't rise up automatically to seek to overthrow a government. Don't use your freedoms as a believer to consider yourself free from moral or legislative rules that are set up there to protect against evildoers. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 to 16, as I said before, echoes this. So it's not just Rav Shaul. This is a message going out to all believers. Don't try to militarily rise against Rome. And again, this would have been said to the believers in Jerusalem. Paul would have seen the power of the Roman army in all of his journeys, and he would have seen the consequences against those who rebel. But there's another issue going on here, and that is insurrection done by taxes. Romans chapter 13 leads from here, from what we've just read, into the main issue, resisting taxes against Rome. Taxes were often considered as a part of Caesar worship, where you paid the army and the injustice done against so many people. Caesars, and especially Nero, saw the refusal of paying taxes as insurrection against him and against the Roman government. Tacitus, a Roman historian, actually records a tax protest against Nero that was held around the year 58, which was an act of insurrection. That's why it says here in Romans 13, this is why you also need to pay taxes. For the authorities are God's public officials, constantly attending to these duties. Pay everyone what is their due. Those, the tax collector, pay your taxes. Revenue collector, pay your revenue. Respect, pay respect. Honour, pay honour. Paying taxes to Caesar was also an issue that happened in the days of Yeshua. Yeshua was asked, should we pay taxes to Caesar, especially of Jews here in Jerusalem? Yeshua said, show me the image. On the tax coin, they showed him and he said, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and give to God what belongs to God. And it says they were amazed at that answer. Just because you pay taxes does not automatically mean you worship Caesar. But it does have to keep the peace. Withholding taxes will be likely seen by Nero as an insurrection against him. So therefore submit to the government and pay your taxes. And we can apply both of these points that we've covered here in Romans 13 into our world. One, don't automatically protest the government, especially rules designed to give peace and order and protection against evil in our society. Obey godly laws and pay taxes. But the question is, does the Bible support protest against government and leaders? And if so, in what situation? There are many acts in the Bible we find of refusing to submit to government authorities. We don't have time to cover it all, but we can just have time to one. A couple of these. In today's parashah, Lech Lecha, get out from your father's house. In other words, get out from following your father's ways. The tradition of Abram's father Terah being an idol worshipper. You must stand up against your father's ways, your father's gods, and leave them. So again, that's an act and statement against following the authorities over you, the ruling powers over you. But we move on quickly from that into Exodus chapter 5, and there's so many other ones we could cover. But chapter 5 verse 1 tells us there, after that Moshe and Aaron came and said to Pharaoh, this is speaking against the authority of the land. Here is what Adonai, the Lord God of Israel, says, let my people go. Let my people go so that they can celebrate a festival to me in the wilderness. Exodus chapter 7, Exodus chapter 8, Exodus chapter 9, Exodus chapter 10 also say those words, let my people go. Why? So they might worship me. That's the key, folks. Let my people go so they might worship me. And we find this principle throughout the scriptures. The Exodus account gives us the grounds to speak and act against the government, that of freedom to worship God. Moses stood against Pharaoh. He was the government leader. He was considered the top god of all gods. And that's a central story of Judaism and even of the whole Bible. Moses stood against him to enable Israel to worship Adonai, the one true God. But we have many other examples. That of Joshua overthrew evil governments in the promised land so that Israel could worship their God. You've got to understand the book of Kings and all the prophets were actually written against the leaders, given against the kings, the rulers, and also against the people. And basically the message, if you boil it all the way down, is your ways, evil ways, hindered the worship of Adonai, and you caused the Davidic dream to become a nightmare. They condemned the kings and the leaders and the rulers in the strongest terms for worshipping other gods. Some parts of those there would find it difficult to preach today. Look at Ezekiel chapter 16. That'll be difficult to preach today. They also condemned the people for not worshipping with pure motives. In revival, they came for the party, not for the prayer. They challenged the people also in both the kings and in all the prophets for not holding the kings accountable. They didn't speak against the leaders. The silence against evil actually supports evil. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I've shared of him a few weeks ago. Silence in the face of evil is evil itself. Martin Luther King from the USA said, silence is actually betrayal. We find also, fast forward through the scriptures, that of Daniel. Daniel defied the king and he refused to stop praying when the king banned the prayer. He ended up in the lion's den. What would people say today? Just go along with it. Look what Romans 13 says. Just submit to the government. Compromise a little bit. Just compromise a bit. Compromise or no compromise. What would they say? Daniel chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to kneel before the king and they were thrown alive into the fire. There they met the fourth one in the fire. Who was that one? Again, what would people say? Kneel, submit to the king. The place there by God. Just go along with it. You're going to affect the whole community if you don't. What about the new covenant? The statement that Yeshua is king, Yeshua hu at Adonai, Yeshua is Lord, is a statement against Caesar. You will not force your Caesar worship, your emperor worship onto us. Proclaiming Yeshua's Messiah into the Roman world was an act of defiance against Caesar. The book of Acts starts in Jerusalem, but all the way through ends in Rome with the members of Caesar's household now worshipping Yeshua, an act of defiance against Caesar. The book of Revelation is written to challenge who you trust, who you worship, God or Caesar. And I gave a couple of messages on that a few months ago. The Talmidim stood against the Sanhedrin when commanded not to speak about Yeshua as the Messiah. In Acts chapter 4 and verse 9 there, Kepha and Yochanan said to those of the Sanhedrin, the governing ruler of the Jewish people in the land, and said, you must judge whether it's right in the sight of God to obey you rather than God. But as for us, we cannot help but talking about what we've seen and heard. In other words, we're not going to follow you. We are going to follow after what we've seen and heard. You judge whether that's correct or not. Acts chapter 5, verse 29, Kepha and the other emissaries answered, we must obey God, not human, the worship of God. What about some other righteous stands in our community? What about that, even of the Holocaust? Remember, those protecting Anne Frank and the other Jews were actually disobeying the government of the day. Those who did hand over the Jews to the Nazis were obeying the government. You had good Christians who worked in the death camps, slaughtering millions of Jewish people and others. Same with the Russian pogroms and other persecutions. Believers in Muslim countries today have to make a stand against the governing authority of the day in order to worship the one true God of Israel. Today we're called by our governments even to hand over our neighbours who break COVID lockdown rules, guidelines. They're not laws, they're just guidelines. My wife's great-grandfather was one of the resistance fighting in Poland against the Nazis, and her grandfather and her grandfather's brother. And they were arrested by the Nazis and they were taken to Auschwitz. And her great-grandfather caused a diversion to enable her grandfather and her grandfather's brother to escape out. He tragically lost his life there in Auschwitz. But her grandfather, praise God, was saved, otherwise Anna wouldn't be here today. They rose up against the authority of the government at that time. Did they do evil? Did they do wrong? Bonhoeffer, what we quoted beforehand in his book of the cost of discipleship and all the things that he did there standing, he also stood, and he was actually part of an unsuccessful plot with other pastors and other leaders seeking to overthrow Hitler. What about the days of slavery? What about the days where we find that people who stood against the government to overthrow slavery, people like Wilberforce and Wesley, John Wesley, people like Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace, they stood against the government to overthrow slavery. In the USA, the Republican Party was formed for the purpose of overturning slavery. We forget about these things. What about the suffragettes, the brave women who stood up and opposed the government, seeking to let women have the right to vote? The civil rights movement. A couple of years ago at this time, I was actually in Memphis with my son, and we went down to the memorial there in Memphis to remember Dr. Martin Luther King. And there, one who stood against the government of the day to permit the coloured people and others to have the right to have equal rights and equal vote. And I read on the wall inside the cells that made up that Martin Luther King was held in. And written on the wall there, the words you see on the screen, the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen councillor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice. One of the great tenets of Judaism, and especially that of even Reformed Judaism, is Deuteronomy 16 verse 20. Justice, justice you shall seek. Folks, are we seeking justice in these days? We've got to remember the phrase separation of church and state was not a state idea. They didn't want it. It's the church standing against the state, saying to the state, you will no longer tell us how we will worship, when we will worship, and what we will preach. Until then, the state had the right to do it. You will no longer control our worship services and what we do. What we do as believers. What will we do as believers when the government puts restrictions on worship? Will we speak out, and how? What do we do when the government starts enforcing woke agendas, banning us from preaching what the Bible actually says? Remember Israel Folau posted 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 9 and is treated as if he has done the worst of crimes. What if the government starts restricting on worship? What about if they bring in, as has already been suggested, no vaccine, no worship? Should we speak out? One of my very good friends in Ireland just sent me a clip of this Irish priest bravely standing up there in his pulpit there in Ireland, speaking against the government, saying that the Constitution says we will always have the right to worship. You have now taken this right away from them. This is the question that we have to ask in these days. What if the government starts restricting more? Is there an agenda around this world? Are we in the days of Revelation where we'll be forced to worship via cultural ways and cultural woke agendas? As Isaiah chapter 5 says, woe are the days when evil is called good and good is called evil. Do we speak out? Do we compromise? This is a question we all must both ask and answer. Understand, Rabbi Lawrence and our team could be arrested and fined for holding regular services face to face at the moment. And sometimes if we address some woke agendas. Hebrews chapter 10 verse 25 encourages us to continue on and not neglecting our own congregational meetings as some has in the practice of doing. Remember, Hebrews was written under the time of persecution as well. But rather encouraging each other, let us do this even more as we see the day approaching. Where do you stand if you're denied the ability to worship face to face, when at the same time we can go down and pack out Coles and Woolies and other shopping centres? Do we cry out now, let my people go that they might worship me? Abba, we pray, put this in our hearts and let us know when to say, when not to say, when to declare your word over the word of what others would say that are contrary to your word. Give us that insight that we might take that place to do your word. We thank you, we praise you, Adonai, because you have made the way.